said, my name is Chris or CJ, and I teach French, Italian, and a little bit of Spanish, and also classes for language teachers on language teaching at the University of Nebraska at Kearney, which for those of you who aren't from Nebraska, I'm not from Nebraska either, but it's where I work. It is a state school of about 6,000 to 7,000 students in rural central Nebraska. And as I said, today we're going to talk about task-based language teaching. But before I tell you anything about that, I want to give you these discussion questions, and I am going to copy these into the chat, and then I am going to divide you into a couple of breakout rooms so that each breakout room has maybe somewhere around 4 people or so. So here come the questions in the chat. And here come the breakout rooms. I'm just stopping the screen share to put you in breakout rooms. And I'll do 2 breakout rooms for now. And let's say that I will give you something like 5 minutes, but that's a very flexible 5 minutes that we can adjust as we need. All right, so here come the breakout rooms. Okay. 5 minutes or so.
Yep, there you go. There. All of your entries. That's a lot of chairs.
You need to accept an invitation to the party of your life.
Which one do you want me to join?
They have exactly the same number of people, so that is totally up to you.
Oh, great.
We definitely don't have 48 right now, do we?
Okay, and then I will go to the second one.
That's up to exactly the same number. Were we able to get through at least one or two of these questions? Okay, I'll wait a moment. It can't be more than 1 minute until everyone is here. Okay, we might as well start talking about these. So tell me, in your view, what is the primary goal of language learning? What are we trying to get out of language learning? You can just jump in. You don't have to raise your hand or ask for permission.
Oh, I think my goal of learning a language is I'm interested in in building relationship, getting to know people. So communication with other people, getting to know their culture, getting things done is my primary goal.
Getting things done, getting to know people, communicate with people. Okay. That sounds like a good goal. What does everyone else think? Do you have similar goals? Do you have not similar goals?
Just interested in that language.
Pardon, I can't hear you very well. It's probably me.
And I think when I started to learn a language, I am only interested in that language. I'm interested in the language itself. Can you hear me?
And what do you mean by being interested in the language itself? You're interested in the structures, in the history of the language, in the cultures behind it, in knowing how to communicate in that language. It's not the same thing.
And how other people to express their ideas in another language.
And you are interested in how other people express their ideas in another language, primarily so you can study how those people express themselves, or so you can express yourself to those people in their language.
I think I'm interested in linguistic itself.
In like the features of the language and the structures of the language.
Yes.
Okay, so you study languages to know about the language. Crystal, on the other hand, studies languages primarily to do things to communicate. Any other ideas? There's no right or wrong answers. Everyone can have a different primary goal. I have mine, you have yours. We all have some kind of primary goal.
Okay, I think I want to learn language eventually to read the literature for that language. So that would be different from reading translations.
So that you can get the full experience as the author intended it, right?
Right.
So you want to learn a language in order to read the literature. The person before wants to learn a language to understand how the language works, to study the structures of the language. And Crystal wants to learn the language for the sake of communication, to talk to people. Does anyone have any other ideas of a primary goal of language learning? Or does anyone match one of those ideas if you don't have a different new idea? Okay, well, I think it's important that we know what our goals of language learning are, especially if we're looking at our own language learning. But if we're language teachers, I think it is really, really important that we consider our students' goals for language learning, which sometimes match ours and sometimes don't. I'm sure that we have all had students who are taking a language class for no other reason than because they have to, because it's a graduation requirement in high school, because it's a general education requirement in college. And yeah, that's something we have to deal with. But we also have students who want to take a language. Sometimes they want to take it to read literature. Sometimes they want to take it to learn about the features of the language. But maybe this is different in different parts of the world, but at least in the United States, research shows that a very, very large majority of language learners in college, in high school too, study languages to learn to communicate with people, to learn to talk with people. And they also show that even for those people who aren't very excited about taking a language, who take one because they have to, those students are more convinced by communication than they are by most other things. I'm not saying there are any right or wrong goals. There are not. We all have different goals. But if we want to get through to students, if we want the students to do things in class, the right things in class, stay on task and actually learn something, then we kind of have to give them at least a little bit of what they want to learn how to do. So today we're looking mostly at how we can further communication, communicative competence, not just in speaking, though especially in speaking, but also in reading and writing through task-based language teaching. So now that you know that we're talking about communication primarily, how would you say that the language classes you took as students did or did not promote communication? Like, would you say they were communicative language classes or not really, and why?
That I think when I start to think about the language classes, English class I had in high school, it's more like the teacher is trying to explain one sentence structure or sometimes two, and it give us multiple examples and, ask us to make up sentences. And when we make sentences and he's trying to correct us. And when we're done with this, he gives us more, like, you have to do the exercise from 8 to 10 on the textbook. And then he explained again, and then we come back to the text we are reading, we are learning the textbook. So I don't see there is any element of communication actually, embedded in there. It's more like, okay, we practice the sentence structure, make sure we make the right sentences, and then we understand what the textbook is talking about. That is.
And the textbook talked about grammar structures, or the textbook had like literary text, or what was in there?
The textbook is actually, articles in English. So we read paragraphs or, a short article about something.
So this class probably worked fairly well for learning to read English, but it had definitely a grammar focus, and it didn't maybe do much to help you speak English, it sounds.
Yes, that's true. That's why I was not really a good student, and I did not really enjoy what was happening in class. I try to get it done. And if
Sure.
I don't have time to get it done, I just skip,
Sure, because it's boring. It wasn't useful to you.
Yeah. So what I like to do, I would like to watch videos in English. I like to listen to songs in English. And sometimes, back in high school, my brother actually, he had already had a job. So once in a while, he would bought an English novel for me. So that's how I learn English. I learn much more outside of class than inside of class. So, yeah.
Huh. So your class did a lot of grammar, a lot of reading, but hardly any speaking or listening.
Exactly.
What about everyone else? Were your English or other foreign language classes similar to that, or were they different?
Very similar.
Very similar. Did you go to the same high school as Crystal?
No, I think we come from the same country.
And in that same country, is language generally always taught in the same way?
Because at that time, we only be tested by the written tasks.
And those written tasks are things like write a paragraph on your day, or write a letter to a friend, or like complete the sentence with the right form of the verb,
Yeah, like
the
that.
verb one.
Sometimes the paragraph writing. Yeah.
Okay, so there is some authentic writing, but there is some meaning focused writing,
Mhm.
but there's also a lot of grammar, and there's very little speaking or listening.
Yeah. At that time, I don't know. Maybe it's changed in China, but now.
I don't know either. I know hardly anything about how language is taught in China. Did anyone else have a different language learning experience in China, in anywhere else, that language was taught very differently, that there was a lot of speaking or a lot of listening? I guess that's a no. You may have not gone to the same high school or the same college, but English or whatever second or foreign language you took was taught in pretty much the same way, right?
Yeah. Actually in college, because I'm an English major, I was an English major at that time. So we have speaking class, speaking and listening together, and also
Good.
culture in, then that's when we start to actually talk. Because we're
In college, only as an English major. So everyone who takes English in high school or sometime before doesn't necessarily learn to speak it, or at least not in class.
yeah, that's true.
Huh. But you know what? What you are describing, what you all are describing, is not that different in many other countries, including countries that are absolutely nothing like China. The language teaching is much the same. A lot of grammar, a lot of writing, very little speaking and listening. And you know what? If you did not learn to speak or understand spoken language in English or whatever language you took, it was most likely not your fault. It sounds like your teachers did not give you the opportunities to develop those skills. And if they didn't give you the opportunities to develop those skills, you're not going to develop those skills, at least not in class. You would have to do something outside of class. So we're going to look at how we can incorporate task-based teaching for the sake of communication into language classes. So you may have, as language teachers, heard of different kinds of language proficiency standards that describe goals or objectives for different language proficiency levels. And there's probably many others, but there's at least two very big, well-known systems of language proficiency standards in the world, both of which currently focus on, as Crystal said earlier, getting things done in a language. One of these big systems, and the one that I prefer because it has a bigger international reach, is the CEFR, the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. And the name of it only refers to the origin of it, where it was developed. It is used in many, many parts of the world, though strangely not that much in the US. And it can be used to describe skills in any language on the planet. It's not only for French, German, Italian, European languages, it's for any language on the planet. But anyway, I have this little screenshot from the About page for this Common European Framework of Reference. And I
Do you
have
share your
highlighted.
screen? We
I
cannot
thought
see your.
that I did. Oh, okay. I guess I'm just looking at it myself. Here we go. Sorry about that.
It's okay.
Do you see the screen now? Yes? Okay. So I have this little screenshot, And it says that the Common European Framework of Reference describes in a comprehensive way what language learners have to learn to do in order to use a language for communication. I think that's pretty clear on the goals of the CEFR, the CEFR. It's all about what you can do. It's all about communication. It does not care about what you know about language, like if you know what a grammar form is called or know how to use grammar forms in a decontextualized activity. It cares about whether you can use what you know in language about language to do communicative tasks. And what does that look like more concretely? Well, you probably can't see this well, but that's okay. I just want you to see how it's set up. The CEFR is divided into 6 levels, A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, and C2, where A1 is the most basic and C2 is the most advanced. And for each of these levels, there are descriptions of what a student is supposed to be able to do at this level. I'm just going to read to you one of these descriptions so you get an idea. At the A1 level, a learner can understand and use familiar everyday expressions and very basic phrases aimed at the satisfaction of needs of a concrete type, can introduce himself and others, and can ask and answer questions about personal details such as where he lives, people he knows, and things he has, can interact in a simple way, provided the other person talks slowly and clearly and is prepared to help. That's the A1 level, the most basic level. I'm not going to read you the rest. I just wanted to give you an idea of what these descriptors sound like. As you probably hopefully noticed, it is all about communicative functions. It does not say anything about grammar. It does not say that the learner can conjugate verbs in the present tense. It does not say that the learner can agree adjectives to nouns. That's only relevant in some languages. It's very relevant in the ones I teach. It doesn't say that the learner knows the alphabet. It doesn't say that the learner knows how to write specific characters or understand specific characters. It says that the learner knows how to do certain basic language functions. All right. So there is, at least in the US, one big competitor to the CEFR. I personally don't prefer this competitor, not because it's bad in any way, but just because it is not well known outside the United States, even though it's very well used in the United States. But anyway, this competitor is called ACTFL, the American Council for the Teaching of Foreign Languages, and they have something called World Readiness Standards, which they say create a roadmap to guide learners to develop competence to communicate effectively and interact with cultural competence. That is really not that different from the goals of CEFR. Communication in some form is the key concept for both of them. And what do ACTFL standards look like? Again, there's a grid of different levels and what people can do at different levels. And they start with the novice level and go up to the superior level. Someone at the novice level, the most basic level, can communicate minimally with formulaic and memorized utterances, list and memorize high-frequency phrases, can respond to simple memorized questions, and can satisfy a limited number of immediate survival needs. This novice level is basically the equivalent of the CEFR A1. And my point in showing you this is not to do a webinar about standards, but just to show you that language teaching today is generally very focused on the communicative functions, or at least the people who make these standards, be it ACTFL, be it CEFR, be it something else, are very focused on communicative functions. I'm not going to go through this, but that is just a comparison of what levels on which system basically correspond. And here I took the equivalent levels from each system. Obviously, there's many possible comparisons, but just one possible comparison to show how they stack up. So again, to show how they both focus on communicative functions. Someone at the A1 level can do the satisfaction needs of a concrete type and can answer questions about personal details such as where he or she lives, people he or she knows, and things he or she has. By comparison, someone at the more or less equivalent ACTFL novice high level can do things can talk about predictable topics necessary for survival in the target language culture, such as basic personal information, basic objects, and a limited number of activities, preferences, and intermediate needs. Notice that they do not talk about grammar. in either of these. They also don't really talk specifically about modes or skills like listening, speaking, reading, or writing, or presentational, interpersonal, and I forget the last one in ACTFL, but they talk about skills that can in some way be applied to every skill, every mode, or every skill. So how do we fulfill these goals? How do we as language learners, or how get there ourselves, or how do we as language teachers get our students to meet these goals as described? In theory, every class is based on a specific SEPHR or ACTFL level, as you prefer, as your administrator prefers. I can tell you that I personally base all of my language learning classes, they're not always my content classes, on a specific SEPHR level. But anyway, current iterations of something called skill acquisition theory, don't worry, we're not getting very technical today, to say that you have to practice doing exactly what you want to learn how to do. So in broad terms, if the goal of learning a language is to speak that language, you have to practice speaking that language. So in other words, you have to do speaking activities in class, and preferably speaking activities that are modeled after authentic context, authentic situations that a learner would be likely to encounter outside the language classroom. Can you do other activities that are less authentic? Absolutely, you can. But within a task-based language teaching framework, they would say that these activities should somehow further the goal of real-world communication, that they're just like little steps that lead you toward completing a real-world task. So more concretely than saying to learn how to speak, you have to speak, we could say that in order to learn how to buy a train ticket in whatever target language country, you have to actually do that, like go to Trenitalia or SNCF in French class and actually go through the whole process of buying a ticket without hitting the send button and having to actually pay money for a ticket you don't need. Or in order to learn how to plan a trip like a little weekend getaway or even a big vacation, you have to actually go through the steps of planning a trip, like deciding what you need to do, deciding where you want to go, looking at travel sites and seeing the activities you can do there, looking at hotel sites and booking a hotel that's good for you, and doing anything else you would need to do for that place. If you want to learn how to find a roommate when you're actually living in a target language culture, like say for a language immersion program or whatever, you have to kind of mimic that experience of finding a roommate in class, be it looking at a roommate board at people's little bios and seeing who's a good match for you and who's not, be it through having a little conversation or interview with classmates to see who could be a good roommate for you. I like to do very often these interview type tasks in class, really at all levels and in all languages. And anyway, in order to learn how to do grocery shopping, you have to go grocery shopping, be it online or in person. And in order to learn how to plan a party, you have to actually plan a party. Does that make sense? You have to practice doing exactly what you want to be able to do in the end. And these kind of things, among many, many others, are the kinds of things that task-based teaching, when done right or in a right way, gets students to do. I personally love task-based teaching, though it can be made even stronger sometimes when you combine it with other things. But anyway, task-based teaching is an action-based approach. Both SEPHR and ACTFL advocate an action-based approach, whether or not they use those exact words. Both are interested in what learners can do. And they don't necessarily not care about, but they care a lot less about what learners know about language. Like they don't care if a learner can tell you what the third person singular form in the present indicative is of blah, blah, blah verb. But do they care if you can use that third person singular present indicative to like say what your friend likes to do? Yeah, but they phrase it as a commutative function rather than asking you to know grammar details. And also in task-based teaching, we don't necessarily care very much about fact recall or regurgitation, or at least not for its own sake. Like, for example, going back to the trip planning example, and you're going to have to probably book a hotel as part of your trip. Are you going to have to understand the price of the hotel? Are you going to have to understand the address of the hotel? Are you going to have to understand the amenities it offers? Yes, and those are facts, but they're facts with a higher purpose, with the purpose of fulfilling the goal of booking a hotel and the bigger goal of planning a trip. They're not facts to be recalled for no reason other than to show that you can recall facts. Task-based teaching does not care about pointless display knowledge, pointless fact recall. Everything is focused on completing a real function, a real task. And as we said, you have to practice doing exactly what you want to learn how to do outside of the class in the classroom to the extent that's possible. And thanks to technology like the internet and everything it provides, we can usually get pretty close to the real thing when we have that. So what is a task? There's competing definitions of it. I decided not to go too deep in the literature, and I just actually went to Wikipedia for this to find what some of the most common definitions are, because this is a practice-oriented talk. This is not a research talk. And anyway, I know who all these people are, and I generally agreed with what they said. So one definition of task is things that people do in everyday life. Even though that's a pretty old definition by language teaching research standards, I think it's a great one. I think it's super simple. It has no complicated words, and it really emphasizes the point. Another definition of a task is a goal-based activity involving the use of the learner's existing language resources that leads to the outcome. So it has a concrete outcome. And a third definition of a task, not necessarily the final definition out there, but the final one we're going to look at today, is a work plan that involves a pragmatic processing of language using the learner's existing language resources and attention to meaning, and resulting in the completion of an outcome which can be assessed through communicative function. That one's a little bit more complicated, but you can still see that it's about communication. A task is a communicative function. It's something that people do in everyday life. It is something that has a concrete, observable, measurable goal. It does not have a nebulous, poorly defined goal like know, K-N-O-W, like understand. Those things, yeah, we can measure, but they're a little harder to measure than buying a train ticket. How do we know you can buy a train ticket? Because you bought a train ticket. How do we know that you can plan a trip? Because you planned a trip. Those things are a lot more concrete and a lot more measurable. So beyond what we talked about, what are some of the important characteristics of a task? According to Ellis, the same Ellis you saw on this previous slide, a task has four main characteristics. First of all, it focuses primarily on meaning as opposed to form. It focuses on communicating a message rather than on the grammar structures or the specific words that are used to communicate that message. Also, according to this definition, I admittedly only partially agree with this one, though I think he's on the right track. It has some sort of gap, which can be either an information gap, a reasoning gap, or an opinion gap. An information gap means that there's something that someone else knows that you don't, that you have to find out. A reasoning gap means that you have to extend what you know or what's given to you to figure out something else, something a little higher level. An opinion gap is a little like an information gap, except it's someone's thoughts, someone's opinion, that you don't know what someone feels about something. I would argue that some tasks, like say the train ticket, I don't know that they necessarily have any of these gaps, or maybe they do, but I don't know which one it is. But they're still very much a task because they have a concrete objective to be fulfilled. And I've heard some people say, and I agree with this, that a task gives people a purpose for using language, whether that purpose is satisfying an information, a reasoning, or an opinion gap, or satisfying some other type of need. In any case, there is a reason, a need for using language. And also in task-based teaching, tasks allow learners to choose which linguistic resources, which grammar forms, which vocab words, which other words they use in completing a task. A task, strictly defined, will not tell learners use verbs in the present tense, use verbs in the past tense. That's not task-based teaching. So instead of saying to use verbs in the present tense, the instructions to something that wants them to do that without telling them to do that might just say, write a story about what you do in a typical day, or write a blog post about what you do in a typical day. Or this was my French 2, my A2 French students project this week. Make a video, 1 to 2 minute video, in which you take your followers through some part of your daily life. So they're narrating their daily life in the present tense, but I never told them to use the present tense. The present tense just naturally emerges. And if by chance they found some other structure, some other form than the present tense to use to do that, I would be okay with that. I wouldn't take off anything, because the point was to show us and tell us what you do in your life, not to use the present tense. The communicative function is much, much more important than the forms that you use to do it. And as we mentioned before, another important characteristic of a task is that it has a very concrete, non-linguistic outcome. By non-linguistic, I mean that the outcome is focused on a real goal and not on use of grammar or use of vocabulary. Does this make sense so far? If you have any questions before we see how this usually applies, or how this could apply in real language teaching? All right, and as we do this, you're going to see that most of the time, task-based lessons and curricula have a pre-task that introduces the task and gets learners to think about what they already know that could be applicable to the task, followed by the task itself, followed by the post-task, which is some sort of recap or reflection on the task. Let me show you in a couple contexts how that can work. I have examples from different languages and different levels. I will translate anything important that is not in English. So this is the opening pages of one unit, our current unit in A1 Italian. It is a unit about expressing yours and others' preferences. And they have these pictures to get you thinking. They have this word web of words that they think that learners will already know, either based on previous lessons or based on similarity between these words and their own languages, and it has some activities to get them thinking about what they know. But most importantly is how they express the goals of the unit, which are up here in this little red box. In this particular book, every unit includes 2 final tasks and about 3, they're not always exactly 3, intermediate tasks that lead to these final tasks. So the final task of this unit are to make an infographic on the class's taste and preferences, and also to find the classmate who has the most similar preferences to you. Those are the 2 big goals of this unit. They do not talk about grammar. They do not talk about vocabulary. But are we going to use grammar and vocabulary to make an infographic on the class's taste, or to find the classmate who has the most similar preferences to you? Of course we are. But those communicative functions are much more important than the language we use. So what about the intermediate task? They say to make a graphic on the class's favorite cultural activities, to make a ranking of the most liked and least liked activities in the class, and to lastly take a personality test. Notice that those are all communicative functions. They all have very concrete goals. How do we know that you made a graph on the class, can make a graph on the class's preferences? Because you made a graph on the class's preferences. How do we know that you can make a ranking of the most and least liked things in the class? Because you have the ranking to show for it. How do we know that you can take a personality test? Because you have some kind of result that the personality test gives you. These are very concrete, non-linguistic outcomes. So what does this look like in the middle of the chapter? I'm just going to show you very quickly. I'm not going to go through every activity. They generally start with some sort of activity that gets you to think about the words that you're going to need in the next activity. Then they usually move on to either a written text or a listening text, and they usually have a pre-reading or pre-listening activity that gets you to think a little bit about it. Then they have some sort of comprehension activity. I'm looking here at Italiano Tempo Libero, Italians and their free time. And then after that, they have generally some sort of contextualized grammar activity. Technically, that's not part of task-based teaching in its purest forms, but it can be a really useful complement to task-based language teaching. And there's a lot of research that shows that grammar teaching is really useful when it is embedded in a communicative context, when students see how the grammar is used. And there's also a lot of research that shows that for better or for worse, students don't want classes that focus on grammar, but they want to know something about grammar. And otherwise, they find that there is a big void. So anyway, in these written text, my Italian 1 book and the other levels of this same series highlight in yellow or another color a target language form. Then they ask you in some form, what do you notice? Then they ask you to complete a rule. And then they ask you to do some other activities in kind of the same way that are related. And at the end of each section, you have one of these intermediate tasks, which here is the graph on the class's preferred activities. Here's another section set up in much the same way, activity to get you thinking about vocabulary. Then they have a listening activity, and they have some grammar and context. And likewise, the same kind of thing. A lot of reading and a lot of listening with pre-listening or pre-reading, the pre-task, then the reading or listening task, and then some sort of post-task where you talk about it. And after all that, an intermediate task, a CI, that doesn't mean comprehensive input. It means something in Italian where you apply what you learned. So that is one approach, but that is not the only approach to task-based language teaching. And that was just to show you what the final task look like. And then they have this little reflection on how you did the final task. And you can also evaluate the final task of a classmate. And here is an example of one of the tasks, one of the intermediate tasks, or actually an intermediate task that wasn't listed, but that I created that was still very relevant to the goals that we did yesterday or the day before, sometime recently, in Italian 1. And it was in this chapter about taste and preferences. And I made the students in small groups create the perfect match, the perfect person for me. So in order to do that, I had them write down in their small groups at least 3 questions to get the information that they thought was pertinent to figure out what I liked, what I might want in a person. Then they had to ask me these questions, and I wrote down the answers in a Word document that was on the screen that they could all see. Then in the groups, each group had to make a dating profile of a theoretical person that they thought I would like. Then they presented the profiles to the class, explained who these people were, what they liked, and also why they thought the person was a good match. And then as a class, we would decide why this person was or wasn't a good match. And I would especially ask other groups who didn't make this profile to make sure that they were paying attention and understanding what was going on. And after all profiles were presented, or as many as we were going to do for that day, we decided who did it best and why, who came up with the best candidate for me. And this is a screenshot of who we decided was the best candidate for me. I don't know if you speak Italian, but I can tell you that everything here is not exactly perfect. There's a significant amount of spelling and grammar errors, but it is not in any way incomprehensible. And comprehension is what is important, especially at a basic level like A1. I understood everything they said. They followed all the directions. So this is honestly an A job in my book. So what could we do in another class? This is from A2 French. This is last week's weekly Instagram project, the most recent finished project that we have. We do a weekly Instagram project in all of my A and B basic and intermediate level French classes, and Italian we do something similar. But anyway, the project was to make a poster or graphic on your college major or anticipated college major that convinces your friends to take this major. So right here in pink is what this girl made on an app called Canva, C-A-N-V-A, about her translation and interpretation major. She has the characteristics like the classes you take in this major, the skills you acquire, and also the professional outcomes, the things that you can do as a graduate in this major. And then after that, for a different day in the week, the students have to comment on their classmates' post, which is another opportunity for authentic language production, for authentic writing rather than writing essays. Nothing wrong with writing essays, but hey, students in their personal lives use social media a lot. So I personally think it's useful to try to mimic this social media life in class, social media use in class, as we do here. And you can see screenshots of the comments that were written on this post. This was the original poster, my major, and someone else writes, it seems to be a good major for you. And yet another person writes, a noble profession. Someone else writes, legal translation is very important for many people. And yeah, a couple of the comments appear in both screenshots. But anyway, that shows you what the project looks like and the comments that the students write. How do I grade this? I have an A2 rubric that basically asks if they can complete certain A2 communicative functions. If they do, A, and it also gives them an engagement grade for how much they interact with their classmates and how meaningful those interactions are. Of course, how meaningful those interactions are, that depends on the level, because basic level students aren't capable of producing the same amount of language as advanced level students. So it's still to the A2 level, but I care about, did they complete the task and did they engage with their classmates, all at an appropriate level, which in this case is A2. So this is the last example task that I am going to show you today. This is from a B2 to C1 level professional Spanish class, a class where students learn to explore their skills and interests and decide what professions work for them, and to also apply for jobs, go through the whole process, and then later do a whole bunch of job-related tasks. And this task here, our most recent completed task or project, was to make a CV or resume. And this is in Canvas, our course management system. The rubric that for this girl who speaks Spanish at home, she's of Mexican origin, was at the C1 level. And notice that it says target level C1, and it says 4 out of 5. It's just kind of weird. It's just how the rubrics are set up on this platform. She didn't lose anything in the cases it says 4 out of 5. I allowed just for a bonus point for kids who are like beyond the target level. 4 out of 5 is 100%. So she only lost 1 point, which was on vocabulary richness, that I thought that her vocabulary level was slightly below the target level of C1, and instead I gave her a B2. But everything else, written expression, coherence, grammatical accuracy, and spelling, that was all appropriate for the C1 level. And you're probably thinking, wait, we just said that grammar isn't important, that spelling isn't important in task-based language teaching. Well, I don't know that I would say it's not important, but it's less important. And I see absolutely no problem with, and I even highly encourage you to include a small category for grammar and or spelling on your rubrics. But I believe that well less than half of the grade on a given task should be based on either of those things or even those things combined. The completion of the task is more important. And I think it's also important to notice that systems like Sephora and ACTFL also do have grammar and spelling descriptions of how well you should be able to spell, how good your grammar should be at a given level. And these are copied and pasted Sephora descriptions. And as you might expect, your spelling and your grammar get better as the language level gets higher. And it's also fair to say that as the language level gets higher, spelling and grammar will never more important than communication get to be more important than they are at previous levels. And also, like when you're dealing with students like this one, and there's many similar students in this class who speak the language at home, they generally know how to communicate really well, but they have maybe a less rich vocabulary than someone who was, say, fully educated in a target language country because they haven't used their language much in an academic context. And we're all guilty of this. I know that I am, because they're so in contact with English. There are often a lot of English influences, like really direct translations of sentence structure, of sometimes made up words or sometimes differently used or misused words because they look similar to an English word but aren't actually used that way. So when you get to these high levels, you can like focus a little bit more on perfecting the structural stuff, but at the same time, the completion of the task remains more important than any of the structural elements. So you might ask, how can we incorporate grammar in a task-based framework, especially in a lower level class? We already saw that a little bit in the basic level Italian unit that I showed you. Here's from some of my own materials. This is from the same A2 French class, but this is a different unit, the unit that we will be doing this coming week. I give them a weekly packet every week, and here's some screenshots from that weekly packet. But anyway, what are the goals for this weekly unit? To talk about one's life experiences, to talk about past events, and to describe the French school system. And I also meant to put there to compare French-speaking school systems to each other and to other non-French speaking school systems. But anyway, for homework, they do something that is totally not task-based, but gets them kind of ready for the more task-based stuff we do in class in the form of really traditional, in my opinion, super boring grammar activities, but it at least gives them a initial exposure to the form. And then after that, when we get to class, I present them this text, T-E-X-T, and we generally do some sort of pre-reading that gets them to think about it. Then we read the text. This is from a blog, and this is a little biography where the blogger tells us about his professional journey and how he got to do what he's currently doing. And I give them a written comprehension activity where I give them some statements regarding this guy's professional experience that they have to put in the right order. And I just conveniently used the target form, which is a type of past tense in each of these statements, though I never said anything about it. And then after they put these statements in order, I asked the students what they think of this professional journey and also how it compares or doesn't compare to their own professional journey. So this is completely meaning focused. And then after that, I call their attention to the target form. I copied this same text again, except I highlighted in yellow the occurrences of the target past tense form. And I just asked them, what do you notice about the highlighted verbs? I didn't lead them any more than that. I just wanted to see what they noticed. And they generally do notice what I would hope they would notice about how this is formed. And then after that, I asked them, what do you think the purpose of this grammar form is? And after that, I ask them to try to write a rule after they've already talked about what they've noticed and what the use is that explains how you form this grammar form. So that is a sequence of how I could incorporate grammar. And then because it's good to provide multiple pathways to the same knowledge, I do basically the same thing again, but through a YouTube video from a travel vlogger who tells us how he got to be a travel vlogger. I have a pre-listening where they look at the vloggers, who's also an Instagrammer's Instagram page, and try to come up with what they think his personality and interest are, and make also some guesses about his experience. And then I give them a listening comprehension task where I give them a list of possible academic and professional events, some of them real, some of them fake, and ask them to check off the ones that the guy actually did. And then I ask them to react to this experience, compare it to their own. And then again, I do a attention to form activity where I transcribed about a minute of the video. And in the transcription, I highlighted the target language forms and asked the same questions. What do you notice? What do you think this form does? What is the rule? Is it a little redundant based on what I told you before? Yes, but I'm purposely redundant in this case because I want to give them more practice and more and different exposure to this past tense form. But notice that until now, I have not really had them do any traditional grammar activities other than the stuff I had them do before they got to class, which is not task-based teaching whatsoever, but can still be used in small doses to support it. And this is the more attention to form. Then I put a little bit of a verb game, not task-based teaching at all. But again, it's okay if it supports task-based teaching. And lastly, I put an extension task or a final task, which is to make a graphic or a flow chart, however you like. I don't want to limit their creativity. I just say a graphical representation of your own professional journey that they're going to share with the class. So that is how I incorporate grammar in context. And some people call what I told you here the PACE method, which has many variations. PACE stands for presentation, that you first start with something meaning focused, no grammar, no direct grammar. Then you do the A stage, which is attention to form, like where I highlighted the verb forms and then asked them, what do you notice? Then we have the related but separate co-construction stage, which is where I asked them, what do you think the rule is? And I first asked them to think about it on their own in a think, pair, share model, and then to talk with a classmate, and then to talk with us all together. And lastly, to do an extension activity, which is like the last activity here, where I asked them to make a graphical representation of their own professional journey. The grammar game doesn't really fit anywhere in that PACE model or in task-based teaching, but I just decided that it would be useful to give them a little bit more grammar practice before they do something real. And as you might expect, this is the first time they're seeing a fairly major verb form, verb tense. They're going to have plenty more activities and plenty more lessons using the same verb form in different contextualized ways. So anyway, you can embed grammar into a task-based teaching lesson through PACE: presentation, attention, co-construction, and extension, where you start with meaning, then call their attention to the form, then ask them to try to come up with the rule and work through it together. And lastly, make them do some sort of meaningful extension. So the last thing I have, or excuse me, the second to last thing, is to try to come up with some task. So I think I am going to put you back into breakout rooms, maybe 2 breakout rooms. And I am going to have you try to come up with a couple of tasks that you could use in your own context. Or you know what, we're a small group. Why don't we just do this together? I'm going to copy this into the chat so that I can see you rather than see the PowerPoint. But take a quick moment to read through what we have there. And let's think about some task that we could use in our teaching context. Preferably not the same exact task that we've already seen, but they can definitely be inspired by those. Any ideas of some tasks we could maybe do in class? They can be for any language or level. So what is something meaningful that you could do in your language classes that furthers a communicative goal? So we saw a couple tasks. We're learning sports this lesson. Can we compare sports interest? Of course we can. That's a great task.
I think we can just unmute and talk.
Yes, please.
I think that's easier. Too slow.
But yes, of course you can compare sports interests. Maybe you could come up with some sort of interview task that you like ask your classmates what sports they like and dislike and why maybe, and then try to decide who's most similar and different to you, and or if the people you talk to are similar or different. You could do something like that.
I was thinking to a very, very small task, ask students to novice student and ask them to post advertisement for our Chinese New Year and ask them where should we post them, and then we learn the language structure of 把贴在什么地方 means post something at some place.
So you mean they have them make like a social media post about
No, more
Chinese
kind of
New
like around the classroom. Where do I post? Yeah, social media too. I was more thinking about in the school. Where do I put my post in? And
it would be the same learning goal.
Right.
Either way.
Yeah, that would be cool too. But I was more thinking about physically, so students get a little bit break and get really thinking about it. Where do I post that advertisement and kind of like that. That's for very novice level.
I think that's a great idea. And you could ask them to do more with it in a less novice class. A test like that is appropriate for pretty much any level, but you can adapt the instructions a little bit to the level.
Exactly. So for more advanced, then kids can say, okay, well, I think we should put this in where because blah, blah, blah. And then they can write way more.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and obviously as a French and Italian teacher, I haven't done Chinese New Year, but I have had students even in A1 basic level classes plan parties for target culture holidays and make a poster on their party and then present the posters to the class and tell us what we're going to do in the party. And then we have to ask them some questions and comment on the party proposal. And after all the proposals, decide who planned the best party and why. Or in other words, decide what party we want to go to.
Absolutely.
It's kind of the same thing. And that could easily be adapted to Chinese or another language too.
Yeah. Will be fun and meaningful.
Any other ideas of meaningful tasks for whatever your language or level might be?
I would like to share something that's not from my class, but Heather Swittner has shared. Talked about at their pre-conference workshop at NILA. It's very interesting. It's mysterious map. So the teacher has a map somewhere in the classroom, and the students are in different groups. All of them, each group has to figure out what the map look like. So one student from each group go to see the map and then come back and describe it to the rest of the group. And everybody try together to figure out what the map look like. So it's so students take turns to take like 30 seconds look at the map and come back for more information. And this way, all the students was trying very hard to figure out the map. And one to make it more fun, one in each group, there is one spy and all the others are soldiers. So the spy is trying to destroy the map, to destroy the task, so to make the map doesn't work, and all the else is trying to make the map work. And the task is to draw the map and at the same time try to figure out who is the spy. So I think it's really fun.
Yeah, sounds really
I
fun.
like that.
Yeah, I was just did a little project recently. It's about a landmark. Again, this is in novice level. I asked the students to find a landmark. I made a PPT starting page and put my example there, what I want from that landmark. And then kids contribute, each kid contribute one slide. And then we kind of like did lots of scaffolding. We are doing, first you find the landmark, then kids have to say, what's the name of the landmark? And then they talk to each other, and then they get that first sentence. And the next sentence, they will have to say, okay, my landmark is in certain place. And then they have to talk to each other and ask and answer that question. And then kind of like expanding more and more, where's the landmark? And so I find it very, I feel very rewarding, and I feel kids have the same feeling too. So we were all interesting. We started with talking, speaking, and then after that, they have to type out the sentences in Chinese characters. So because we had so many rounds of practice, and then end up to be, it's novice level, so but they have 5 sentences each students, and feel very happy about it.
That sounds like a good activity, and you get culture in there too.
Oh yeah, always trying to figure out what can I do. I think for the task base, I'm trying to do that. I'm exploring how to do task based.
How to make that task based? I think that you can change it very, very little to make it task based. You could have them do presentations, very small presentations on landmarks, and maybe to make sure the students are paying attention, have them complete a small outline. And you can ask the students after each presentation, the ones who weren't presenting, some sort of questions. Though I would probably not ask comprehension questions, but ask questions like, do you want to visit that landmark? Why? And then maybe after a couple of—
That's the extension I'm going to use. I haven't do that one. I want to do that. Give them some pre-sampled words to say, because it's exciting, because it's scary. Something like for them, so they can just click and know how to say it. Yeah.
Yes, it can be helpful to give them like a little set of words. You don't in pure task-based teaching doesn't do that, but more recent iterations of task-based teaching do see that as useful, and I would agree that it's useful in many cases. And maybe after every student, or every student who's going to present, presents, you could have everyone make a final decision of which landmark they most want to visit and why, what their favorite landmark is.
I'm so sorry I came very late. Do you have kind of like a definition of task? What is count as task-based teaching, and what's the difference between task-based and project-based?
To me, task-based and project-based teaching are the two sides of the same coin, and there is not really any practical point to distinguishing between the two. Both of them have a concrete, measurable, communicative goal that focuses on what students can do with language rather than on grammar or vocab forms. I guess I would say that task is generally, or not necessarily, a project is generally bigger than a task, but it's really the same idea. As I said, there's not really any purpose, in my opinion, to separate between the two. To me, it's a theoretical argument that has little practical implication.
Okay. Am I talking too much? I'm sorry.
No,
And,
I would much rather people talk than have it all be silent.
okay, and then I have another question. Between the project-based project PBL, right? And now people talking about the PBLL. And project-based is very exciting, but then when you are in the classroom, students cannot talk. That's very frustrating. So I guess where does this L come from? I'm wondering, like, do you have any tricks? How do we make it into language? PBL.
Yeah, it is not universally true that assigning projects leads to students who can't talk. It totally depends on the kind of project you assign them. You could assign them some sort of group or pair project that they have to do a lot of interaction in the target language. And I don't do projects all the time, though I do at least one project a week in a given class. And I also do a lot of smaller tasks, some speaking, some reading, some listening, reading and listening with authentic materials when I can. And I make sure that I get a significant amount of speaking in the class. And if I don't have anything more creative in mind, my go-to for speaking is an interview activity where they have to in some way ask a couple classmates about whatever the topic of the day is. And I usually give them not fully formulated questions, but a list of topics to at least get them thinking while still making them produce more language. And then at the end of that interview, they have to decide if the people they talked to were similar or different to them, and who was the most similar and why. I guess a task is generally smaller than a project, and I would say that that's a task, but not a project. Projects are tasks, but tasks are not necessarily projects. I guess that's a true statement.
That's true.
And sometimes in small classes, it works to do full class discussion. If the class is small, if you have the right kids, if they are interested in the topic and they actually like to participate, but that doesn't usually work so great in larger classes. And by larger classes, I mean something that has more than 5 to 10 students. Well, it really depends on the class. But anyway, I think it's usually good for speaking and other things to mix the small group or pair activities with full group activity, with full class activities, so there's a little bit of something for everyone, but at the same time making sure that all the speaking activities and other activities are meaning focused, or at least most of them, that there's the greater purpose of making meaning, even if there's some form focused and even an occasional very, very traditional activity in there. Does that make sense? Sometimes I work on it.
Yeah.
So I think we have some pretty good ideas of what tasks are and what we could do for tasks. And I had just a in the discussion slide here, we definitely don't have time to go through all these questions, but I'm going to ask you, what concerns do you have about task-based teaching? And maybe we can try to resolve these concerns.
Yeah, when I was teaching in Omaha Central High School, there's some students, you know, there were some family issues there, you know, something's going on in their life. So they will be missing for 2 or 3 days. At that time, it's really hard to, you know, when you're doing task-based, teaching and everybody else, I mean, some other students in the group has already started, and it's hard to bring the student in because it is, you know, a little bit difficult.
Yeah, I think that's a really hard problem to deal with. I guess the best that we can do, if that's a recurring problem in a school, is to maybe have more smaller tasks or smaller projects that don't go across days, so that a student who misses class, yeah, missed something, but didn't like miss a part of the project that we're still working on today.
Yeah, that's true. So it's, if we have, but most of the time because we have like only 42 minutes for class at that time, so it's hard to have, I mean, the whole thing, I mean, whole task done one day, a lot of times. So
It depends on the task. Yeah,
yeah. So
you
yeah,
could
maybe we should
absolutely.
do smaller.
Pardon?
Yeah. I mean, smaller would be better in that case, I think. Yeah, you are right.
I don't tell anyone what they should do, because I hate being told what I should do. But I could see how having smaller tasks would make it easier for students to jump in if they miss class. Yet at the same time, sometimes the larger tasks or projects are really interesting, and I wouldn't tell anyone not to do them. I do them. I think they're great.
Sometimes I think I probably also make the task as individual instead of like as a team.
Why?
Everybody have to have accomplish individual task, but yet they can with a team partner together. This way, if kids missing a class, you give them the instruction, they can still do it at home if possible.
Oh, you mean a task, a group task with different parts where each group member is assigned a different parts.
For
Is that right?
more on like not every task will build on another people's task.
It does build on people's task, or it does not?
Does not.
So a task that's completely independent.
Right, but it can, in the meantime, if we want to, we can plug them in and become part of a larger group.
Sure, you
I know
can.
that's from
You can do
theory,
that.
but yeah. I
No,
mean,
yeah, you can absolutely do that. And I guess another way to do that would be like a group task that's only sort of a group task, where everyone is assigned a totally different part to do and isn't really and isn't like sitting there working together with their group mates, or maybe they are, but they're not working on the same thing.
right. I think that's probably helps with that type of issue.
I think it can too. And I think that fully individual tasks are also okay, but
Yeah.
I don't know that I would do fully individual tasks all the time, because I think it's important that students get that interaction. And also, we all know that we have students who have no idea what they're doing, whether because language just isn't their thing, or because they don't make any effort, or they do make an effort, but they just struggle. And those students are not necessarily going to do great work if they're alone. In all honesty, groups might not be happy to have them, but for the struggling kid's sake, that kid will probably get more out of group work, at least with the right group, than he will working alone. So I think it's just good to mix it up. Sometimes group projects where everyone's really working together, sometimes group projects where you have totally different roles. sometimes tasks or projects where you're completely individual and don't depend on anyone else in any way. Everything has advantages and disadvantages.
Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes we just need to think about what we care most.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. Do we have any other concerns?
Yeah, I have a concern. It's the students, when they do their tasks, they may be just rely on what they always use the same vocabulary, or, you know, they do not expand learning using new things. So,
Yes, I can,
and-
yeah, that could maybe be a problem, but at the same time, part of me wonders, is it really a problem? Like, if they already have some kind of words or structures that satisfy the task, is that okay? And maybe to get them to use different forms or different words, we just need to give them other tasks that necessarily require, without specifically saying they have to use, certain new forms. Does that make sense?
let's say that's a sports interest. If, you know, if their vocabulary limited, they soon finish the task. Let's say compare your interests. They will say, okay, I like playing basketball. Why do you like it? And they cannot say much.
Because I like it.
Yeah. So that's the problem. It's like some students can have a larger vocabulary, they can talk more, and some others, you know, always just say one sentence, then that finish the task.
Oh, I see what you mean. That is kind of a problem. I guess I misinterpreted. Maybe what I would do is not have that interview task on sports standalone, but have it after some other activities that expose students to possible vocabulary and get students to apply that possible vocabulary in ways that require less production, so they hopefully have more to say by the time you get to that more open-ended interview task. In an A1 or novice level, you're probably not going to get them to say paragraphs, but if you can get them to say at least a couple sentences, that's pretty good. If I present vocabulary, I don't know how easy it is done for Chinese. I assume it's not that hard, but I like to find an authentic text, be it a video or a written text, that shows the vocabulary in context. And I will, like, before I give them that, I'll do some sort of pre-reading or pre-listening that gets them to think about what they're going to read or hear. Then I do some sort of comprehension task that maybe I would get them to sort the vocabulary in some way. Like, the easiest thing that comes to mind is sports you like and sports you don't, or sports you do outside, sports you do inside, sports you have to do with someone else, sports you play alone. It really doesn't matter what you're sorting it based on, but just something that gets them to think about what the vocabulary means. And then I might do some other vocabulary activities. Maybe if I started with a video, maybe give them a reading. If I start with a reading, then give them a video. And in either case, do like pre-task, pre-reading, pre-listening task, and post-task, where after the comprehension activity, they then have to react to it or apply it to some way. And then the interview could be an almost final task that maybe it's like the last thing they do in class, but then maybe you have them do some sort of project for homework. I've never taught the topic of sports. What, maybe partly because I just don't like sports, but what could you do for that? Maybe like some video promoting a sports event, or a video or a poster too, or a video or poster trying to get people to sign up for a certain school or intramural sports team, something like that. That could be like the extension task that comes after your interview task. I know that's a lot of thoughts. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
And sometimes I kind of like tell my kids, for example, by the time they get into intermediate level and ask them to compare, they will say, oh, I like, I don't like. And I told them directly say, like and don't like, that 2 words doesn't count. Find something else to say.
To get them to use other words.
Right, right. Sometimes that can be overboard because kids will go to Google Translator and find a million words to say, I have so many words. And then I said, well, you have to, I don't mind if you can find a million words, but you have to master 90%. You have to recognize and be able learn that 95% of whatever you give to me, meaning that I take your script and take out the pinyin, and you have to read it for me. You have to tell me what does each word mean. And
Interesting.
that
As
kind
in
of like,
translate it?
right. Well, kids, like you say, okay, you have to give me those information, and then kids will go to, I just use Google Translator. They can go to GPT, right, to find a huge paragraph. But then you know that they didn't write that.
Yeah.
And I told them that it's okay if you copy. However, you must master all 95% of them. So if I give a test based on whatever you turn to me, you have, that's what I will grade you on. Then
Interesting.
they will be really careful not to give too much. But in the meantime, they don't use like or don't like anymore.
And in reality, do you
Yeah.
give those kind of tests?
Task it to kids.
Do you give the
Test.
test where you make sure they understood what they turned in?
I do a very quick oral test. Here you go.
Ah,
Print out,
okay.
read it for me. And they cannot read. Oops, today's grade is 0. Oh, darn.
That's an interesting idea. And obviously reading it aloud isn't gonna accomplish what you want in languages like French and Italian that are written in Latin script.
Exactly. Yeah,
But
I
I could
understand.
ask them to translate it.
mean,
That would
yeah.
accomplish the goal.
What does this vocab mean? What does vous mean?
Yeah.
What does il frère mean? Il frère.
Yeah.
What does that mean? Yeah. Yeah, that's what I do. And I just do a very oral quick one, just 1 minute. Read,
That's an
tell me
interesting
what's
idea.
this sentence mean.
I should definitely do that because I struggle with figuring out what the role of Google Translate and dictionaries are. Because in task-based teaching, we don't give students big word lists to memorize. It's one thing to give them
Right.
like a couple words or structures that are really essential for a task, but like a comparison structure. But it's another thing to give them a whole word list. In task-based teaching, we generally prefer that they find the words that they need, which they're likely to get, of course, from a dictionary or
True,
Google
yeah.
Translate. So it's like I want them to make good use of technology, but I don't want them to cheat by like getting whole paragraphs out of Google Translate or something like Google Translate, because they're
Right.
not likely to learn much if they do that.
The chat GPT is so good today.
Yeah,
I don't know if you tried. I tested so many topics, and then I know which one kids use the chat GPT, but you cannot accuse them because you cannot go to online to say, oops, you copied it from somewhere. No, because chat GPT wrote it. So I just say, okay, it's yours. I agree it's yours, but you have to tell me, what did you write? What's this? What's that?
That's
And
a good idea, and it makes sure they at least understood it. I think that's a lot better than being like, nope, no Google Translate or no online tools.
And it's going to be here. It won't go out. It's going to be get better and better.
Yeah, and I
So-
admit I use Google Translate sometimes. Do I ever put whole paragraphs in it? No. But will I put words or phrases? Yeah, because it's just so easy to find. It's like the first thing that comes up on your phone or computer.
Yeah, we just have to make it as a learning tool, I tell them.
Yeah, think how to use it to
Smart,
support
yeah.
their learning rather than just use it as a tool to be lazy, as it was when I was in college. I don't think very many people were learning much from it. They were just dumping whole text in it and copying whatever came out.
Yeah, I was thinking novice level, how much kids can say anyway. So it's basically, hello, how are you? And basically, if ChatGPT do a perfect job for them and they memorize it, they master it, go for it. That's replace me.
And
for
maybe
that.
they learned something from that. Maybe they did.
Exactly. For that portion of teaching, they do that, and then now I can ask them to apply it in real life.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah,
Yeah.
I guess I would probably be asking students most often to like translate something for me, since the read aloud doesn't work in French or Italian. If I see something that is like structurally much more complicated than what I'd expect at the given target level. Because I mean, it's easy to look up an isolated word that you don't know and plug it into Italian sentence structure, but it's another thing to like make more complicated sentences or master grammar forms that you haven't seen and aren't like just immediately ahead, that you didn't look just like a couple pages ahead in your book.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
But
what I
that's
do sometimes.
pardon?
That's what I do sometimes to force them, okay, memorize them, know them, and
That's a
really
good idea.
apply them somewhere else. They will say, oops, that's too much. I cannot do that. I'd better limitate to what I can digest.
I'll have to start asking the kids I think use technology in ways I don't like to tell me in English or a language other than the language they wrote what they think it means.
Right.
Like just a sentence or two, not the whole darn thing.
Right. Just isolate the part. Yeah.
That's a good idea. Huh. Thank you.
No problem, Sharon.
Any other questions or concerns? Questions, comments, snide remarks?
I remember one of the teachers in previous webinars actually shared a tool to identify, somebody created a tool to identify whether the students did the work or AI did the work.
Huh. I've heard of something like that, though I can't remember the name of it.
There
Yeah.
is something called chat zero.
Oh, yeah.
Like
That's it.
number zero?
Let me see if I can find that, and I'll put it here if other teacher want to use it. But I tested that too. The way I tested it, like I use what I wrote myself and use that chat zero. I think that's
Is
CH.
chat zero a translating tool?
No, it's a app to catch students cheating.
Oh,
But you're using AI, using tools, I mean, platforms like
Okay,
ChatGPT.
right.
interesting.
So I asked Chat whatever, ask it to write me a little passage, and then I go to that chat zero and asking, is this human right or is this a machine right?
Oh,
And then it will say, oh, it's most likely a machine, or it says, oh, it's a mix of human and machine.
well, that is so interesting.
So it's a technology against the technology.
I need artificial intelligence because I'm not smart enough to understand how this stuff all works. I don't have much real intelligence. So.
It
Zero.
just go
Yeah.
too fast. So I thought of that. I tested myself and I say, okay, sometimes whatever I wrote, it was it's a machine doing, because it's like, again, it's a novice level. How much sentences you can tell students to write.
And I'm also thinking about maybe for some advanced level, or I mean, not novice level at least. Maybe we can ask them to do their task and then ask ChatGPT to do the same task and ask them to compare.
Interesting.
Mhm.
Good
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah.
I mean, how you were doing, how the ChatGPT is doing, and what is better. I mean, in your writing, what do you think is better than GPT, and what do you think is better? I mean, what you can learn from GPT paragraph, I think.
So
Yeah.
the students see the difference.
Yeah, and also they can see actually there's something good in their own writing because it's more personalized, or things like that, and maybe they can learn some better expressions in ChatGPT output. I mean, I don't know. It just came to my mind. It might be interesting.
Okay, I just typed the web where you can use. It's called a GPT0.me.
This is the cheater catcher. This is not the
Yes.
thing that the student cheats,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Interesting. Thank you for the wonderful webinar and great discussion. I really enjoyed it.
Thank
Thank
you for
you.
having me. I
Yeah.
hope you learned a little something. I'll leave my email here in case you have any questions later.
Oh, can you share your PowerPoint or no?
Yeah, like in the chat?
Oh, I mean, are you comfortable to put it online? I mean,
Sure, why
together
not?
with your webinar, yeah.
Sure, why not? Should I email that to you?
Yeah, you can email it to me, and I just emailed your presenter certificate. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
Thank
you're
you for
done.
having me.
Can I have some more questions, but that's not related to, not very related to this. I just heard Chris was talking about using video, lots of videos, right?
Yes.
I'm very